that is why I was late getting started. It's completely my fault. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully it's a nice day where you are as well. I know that often when we do these things, it's easy to get distracted by people's backgrounds. So let me just say a word or two about what you see in my background. I am at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario in my office. And over my one shoulder, you see a couple of paintings by a Mennonite artist named Waldemar Neufeld. And there's a painting of Saskatchewan grain elevator and one of urban Toronto. So two very different Canadian scenes. Behind my other shoulder, you will see into our processing room where we do all our archival work. And behind that wall is our actual archives vault. If you were able to see in front of me and see what I'm seeing when I look out to my glass wall here of my office, you'll see into the library of Conrad Grebel University College. Grebel is a Mennonite college on the campus of the University of Waterloo. So if I were able to look a little further into the outside, I would see the campus of the university. So that's where I am today. And now let me share my screen and we can get started. So the title of my talk is Who Were the Conchies? Ontario Mennonites and Alternative Service during the Second World War. You might be wondering what a Conchie is, if you haven't heard that term before. Conchie is short for conscientious objector, and it was a slang term that was used by sometimes pejoratively, but the Conchies themselves used it as well. And another term that you might hear me use that's kind of slang for conscientious objector is CO. So when I say CO, I don't mean commanding officer. I mean conscientious objector in this context. Alternative service might be another phrase that you haven't heard before. That was kind of as opposed to military service, the other type of service, the alternative service. That was available to conscientious objectors during the Second World War. And that was a program that happened across Canada. I will be talking mostly about what was going on in Ontario at that time. So let's start with a piece of paper from the archives. This is a registration card. And if you were able to come to our archives, you could see that we have a box of about 3,000 of these types of cards, and each one of them says a little bit about the man who is registered. So on the 24th of September in 1940, a man named Arnold Allen Hallman filled out this card. He tells us that he lived on Mary Street in Hanover, that he was 22 years of age, that he was single, that he worked at Nechtel's Furniture as a machinist, and that he had been doing so for about 7 years. So he had a primary school education, and then he went directly into work. He also had some farm experience. He knew how to milk cows. He knew how to handle horses, but he admits that he just does not know how to drive a tractor. He also tells us that he is a member of the Mennonite Brethren in Christ Church in Hanover and has been so for about 10 years. And although Mennonites practice adult baptism and baptizing at 12 years of age seems a little young to us now, that was not uncommon at the time in some Mennonite congregations.
Maureen, it's showing but not in full screen. So we can see your slide, but it's not full. It's got the next slide showing as well. I don't know if it'll give you a full screen option.
Okay. I'm going to try to share it again. 1 second.
That's got it.
That's
Oh,
got it?
It
Great.
did, and then it went away. It went to the other way again. But we can see.
Okay, so you can see it in full now?
Not in full. It did briefly show it in full, and then it went.
How does it look now? Any different?
It's the same.
Oh dear, that's too bad. How strange.
We can still see it though, so maybe.
It would be nice if you could see the full thing.
The full slide.
I'm going to try one more time. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
How's that?
It's showing your next slide, but other than that.
Okay, I think that's probably the best we can do.
Yeah, carry on. Yeah, great. Yeah, no, that's good. It's fairly large.
Okay, good. I hoped you'd be able to see most of the pictures up close. So now we get to the most important questions on the form, the last two questions, and those are, do you intend to appeal for exemption from military training because of your conscientious objection to war? And if so, are you willing to offer your services for civilian work? And Arnold answered yes to both questions. So those might seem like odd questions in the time of war. Do you intend to declare yourself as a conscientious objector? And do you also offer to volunteer your time? So what led to the creation of this form? What led to Arnold's answers and the answers of 3,000 other young men across the province of Ontario in 1940? Where did this notion of conscientious objection tied to being a Mennonite, where did that come from? So to understand this, we have to go back in Mennonite history about 400 or so years to the 16th century. And what you're seeing, I hope, now is a somewhat iconic image in the Mennonite tradition of a man named Dirk Wilms in the Netherlands, who is rescuing another man who has fallen through the ice. And there are people on the shore standing and looking in astonishment at what is going on. So Dirk was what was then called an Anabaptist, so forerunners of Mennonites and Amish and a few other similar groups. This took place during the Protestant Reformation. So there were a number of churches that broke away from the Catholic Church and formed what we know today as Protestant denominations. However, those churches were still very much tied to the state. So you might live in a Catholic state or a Protestant state, but when you were baptized as an infant, it was still also a rite of passage to become a citizen. It was tied with citizenship. Anabaptists were different, very radical groups scattered throughout Europe who said, no, that's not good enough. When we read the Bible, we see that baptism should be the decision that is entered into at a state when you are able to do so. So not as an infant, but as an adult. And they also interpreted the Bible to say that one should practice non-resistance. So not just that one should not kill, but one should not try to repay evil with evil. So the act of Dirk Wilms, who has was jailed for Anabaptists, his Anabaptist beliefs, who escaped and was running across the ice. He hears a noise behind him and he turns, and his pursuer is fallen into the water. And instead of escaping, he turns around and rescues his pursuer, and consequently, he is again imprisoned. So this is kind of the radical ethic of love and compassion, and expressing non-resistance that was at the root of Mennonite teaching. And that's how that developed. Here you can see a couple of documents showing how conscientious objection developed in Canada. In the late 18th century, Mennonites and Quakers, or Society of Friends, and another group called Tunkers, later known as Brethren in Christ. Now their church denominational name is Be in Christ, or BIC. They were given the opportunity to settle in Upper Canada and to not have to join the militia. So they were told that their non-resistant beliefs would be honored. In exchange, they had to pay a militia tax to be exempt from their militia duties. That disappeared later on in the 19th century, but originally that was the arrangement. So on your one side of your screen, on your left, you see a certificate issued in 1869 to a Mennonite man named Moses Huntsberger by the local justice of the peace, just confirming that he's a member of what they call the Mennonist Society, or the Mennonite Church, and that he therefore claims exemption from militia duty. And on the right side of your screen, if it's oriented the same way it is on mine, you'll see a certificate under the Military Service Act of 1917. So, as I'm sure you're aware, there was conscription during the First World War. We just had a big First World War anniversary. And these were cards that young Mennonite men of conscription age carried to signify that it was all right for them not to be enrolled in military service, that they were exempt because of their membership in the church. The Mennonite resolve towards non-resistance was something that, as I said, continued over 4 centuries. It was really emphasized during the First World War. And the leaders of the Mennonite and other peace churches, the leaders of those faiths who entered the Second World War in leadership roles, were determined that alternative service, or some kind of civilian service, would be able to be established so that young peace church men would not have to go to war. One of those leaders was the man whose picture you see there, his portrait, Jacob Jansen. He was born in the Soviet Union. He was a chaplain during the First World War. He was a conscientious objector. He served the church in various roles in the early years of the Soviet Union through the Russian Civil War, therefore putting himself in all kinds of danger. The young men you see in the group photograph on this page are young Russian Mennonite men, so Mennonites in Russia, during the First World War, who were conscientious objectors. And unlike Canada, Russia actually had a program of alternative service already during the First World War. And so these young men served in forestry camps, they served on ambulances, they served in hospitals. And so that Jacob Jansen, when he came to Canada, brought that idea and that tradition with him. When the Mennonite leaders went to Ottawa in 1940 to try to obtain some kind of alternative service for Canadian Mennonite men. They at first met with resistance from Canadian authorities, and that is probably quite understandable, actually. This was some of the darkest days of the war, the early days. America had not yet entered the war, and the Ottawa had its hands full just trying to get a handle on how they were going to support and supply and assist Britain in the war. And so here comes this little group of Mennonites saying, well, what about us? Why can't we have our own little civilian program? So one of their first meetings, there was a general among the committee that met with them. And he, at one point, became very impatient with the Mennonites. And he said, you know, what will we do if we just shoot you? And Jacob Jansen replied, and this is another kind of iconic moment in Mennonite pacifist history. This is Jacob Jansen's reply. Listen, General, I want to tell you something. You can't scare us like that. I've looked down too many rifle barrels in my time to be scared in this way. This thing, this conscientious objection, is in our blood for 400 years, and you can't take it away from us, like you'd crack a piece of kindling over your knee. I was before a firing squad twice when he was in Russia. We believe in this. So the committee, despite that impassioned speech, remained unmoved. So the Mennonite delegates got together that night and decided to try a different tack. And so they went and made an appointment with the Ministry of War Services. His name was James Gardner at the time. And this meeting could not have gone more differently. It turns out Gardner had grown up with Brethren in Christ people he went to school with, so he was familiar with the whole idea of the peace churches and what they were trying to accomplish. And he assured the group that he said, there's 101 things you fellows can do without fighting, and we'll see that you can do them. And so that is essentially the creation of the Alternative Service Program in Canada. And just to point out that conscientious objection had been tied to a strong degree to belonging to a peace church denomination. The Alternative Service Program was opened up to all men of conscience. So that although the majority in the program were Mennonite and Amish, Quaker, Brethren in Christ, the traditional peace churches, Hutterites, Doukhobors as well. There were others such as Jehovah's Witness, United Church people, and people of no particular faith that also were able to sign up as conscientious objectors. So now we get to Montreal River. This was a Depression-era work camp in the 1930s, and it was on the, as you can see, on the shores of Lake Superior. So about 80 miles or so north of Sault Ste. Marie, northwest of Sault Ste. Marie. And it was turned into one of the largest alternative service work camps in Canada, certainly the largest in Ontario and the first in Ontario. And over the course of its 2 years or so of operation, about 570 men served here in 4-month stints. Their job was to extend the road that basically ended in that area. The camp was at the end of Highway 17, and it would be their job to extend it. So they were, as I said, they were originally serving for 4 months. However, at the end of 1942, or sorry, the spring of 1942, that was changed to service for the duration of the war, whatever that might be. So in terms of numbers, there were about 10,000 conscientious objectors who served across Canada during the Second World War. I mentioned some of the different denominations that they came from. About 1/4 of those, so about 2,600 men came from Ontario. So who were these Conchies? Well, they were all young men, mostly rural. So this was a big new experience for them. And Mennonites and Amish and similar groups, although they were a minority and somewhat similar in many of their practices, this is one of those situations where you have very small independent groups who form their own cultures and don't often get to know each other very well. So when Mennonites of different stripes came into contact with each other, this might have been the first time that they might have known a Mennonite from another Mennonite denomination. So it was really a time of mixing and mingling and getting to know each other. So I just have a couple of examples of personal stories of these men. So Peter Neufeld was 22 years old, and his commitment to nonviolence was pretty deep. His father had been murdered during the Russian Revolution when they lived in Russia. After they immigrated to Canada, his mother would not let him even own a hunting rifle. She was so opposed to the whole idea of guns because of their experiences during the war and revolution. So he had really wanted to become a pilot as a boy. That was his dream, but he gave up that dream because he figured as the war approached, if he became a pilot, he would be much more subject to military recruitment, which is something he didn't want to do. So he became a conscientious objector and went to Montreal River. By contrast, Doug Miller was an urban Mennonite man. He worked in an insurance company. He really didn't feel very strongly about non-resistance. However, his family really felt that he should follow this path, so he joined up as a conscientious objector, went to Montreal River. And he feels like the time there was a great adventure for him. He had a great time, but he didn't think about it too deeply until much later, when he said, "The more I think about it, I think war is an absolute crime against humanity, and I got that figured out," he said. And he was a lifelong supporter of many different peace causes after that. So just an example of the different kinds of attitudes that these men arrived in camp with. Now, it soon became apparent to the men that it felt very much like they were just kind of being given busy work and sloughed off somewhere so that they weren't in the public eye, so they wouldn't distract and maybe encourage others to pursue this path. And so morale wasn't always the best. However, in 1942, when the program was opened up for the duration of the war, many of these men were sent out to British Columbia. And there the attitudes changed somewhat because they were doing things like fighting forest fires. The young man on the right with the large piece of machinery there, Len Bechtel, helped to build that piece of machinery to cut wood for homes in Vancouver during the winter when they were suffering a fuel shortage. So they really felt like they were doing more useful work. They were fighting forest fires, planting trees, all that kind of great stuff where you could actually see something in your work that was valuable. So how did the community react to these men? Well, there were varying reactions, so it's hard to generalize. But it seems to be that for the most part, the men who worked with the COs, their supervisors, the camp cooks, who were not Peace Church members, seemed to get along pretty well with them and would defend them if people from the local community were upset about these Conchies being in their communities. Some of the men, as I said, sometimes there were problems with morale. They weren't, especially in Ontario, they hadn't really felt like they were doing something important. So some of those men, conscientious objectors, originally did go and sign up. And so that was something they had to, the men had to negotiate one man, Ray Good, talks about his brother deciding to join up and how that was hard for the family in a way, but he was his brother, so they got through it together. One of the men in BC, Harold Schmidt, had a little bit of banking experience, so he was put to work in the camp office, and the camp supervisor would get letters from people saying, why are you hiding those COs up there? They're not any good. They shouldn't be shirking. And so he would kind of mischievously give those letters to Harold, the CO, and say, Harold, why don't you respond to this letter? And Harold actually, as a young man, felt that was a really interesting challenge and helped him think much more deeply about his faith and his reasons for becoming a CO. There were also, especially in BC, there were other denominations that were not pacifist, but were similar perhaps, such as the Baptists in other theological ways. And they would come into camp and they would sing and give programs and socialize with the men. And so sometimes there would be military men and COs all gathered around a piano singing together. And so there was a sense that even though they were on different sides theologically, there was a sense of coming together. So can Mennonite women be conscientious objectors? Well, for women, there was no obligation, of course, to become a CO or to join the military in quite the same degree that it was with men. However, women experienced this enormous shift in gender roles. Mothers supported their sons, of course, in the CO camps. If the men were married, their wives often had to find work, and they usually ended up making more than their husbands on their tiny CO allowances. Some wives traveled with their husbands to British Columbia to be nearer to them, although they could not live at the camps, and they often found work as maids, for example, in the local community. Rural women shouldered the burden of farm work, of course. That was a common experience among Mennonite women, or all Canadian women. And as they did during the First World War, like other Canadian women, Mennonite women produced goods for relief of war suffering around the world. Mennonite nurses volunteered overseas with an organization called Mennonite Central Committee. Here we have a shot of a canteen that operated by Mennonite Central Committee in Birmingham in England in 1941. Edna Huntsberger decided to become a nurse with MCC, Mennonite Central Committee, and she said, I certainly didn't feel comfortable joining the forces because I'd be part of the war machine. Other nurses were signing up, and I was thinking to myself that I would have some mud thrown at me for not doing anything because I knew they would not understand the conscientious objector point of view. However, she was able to join a Mennonite organization and serve in that way. So beginning in 1943 and lasting till 1946, there was a feeling that there was overwhelming labor shortages in the rest of the economy, particularly in agriculture and industry. And so these alternative service camps were basically closed, and Mennonite conscientious objectors went to work on farms, in industry, and they were able to keep some of their wages, but the rest were given over to the Red Cross. So during those years, approximately $2.2 million from labor of COs in industry and agriculture went to the Red Cross. There are many legacies of the CO experience that continue with us right till today. At the top there, I have a picture of the groundbreaking for Connor at Grable University College, where I am sitting now. That was a a joint effort of different Mennonite denominations that came out of this idea of working together, learning to work together that they learned during the war. And also the idea that pacifism does not just mean not going to war. Creating peace can mean more than just choosing not to fight. It can mean working in development work, for example. It can mean working in active peace building around the world. And so that was an idea that really grew out of the Mennonite Second World War experience and still has many effects today. I will just briefly show you a couple of slides. I know my time is coming to an end. If you want to learn more, there is an exhibit that we did a couple of years ago that now lives online. It's called Conchies Speak, Ontario Mennonites and Alternative Service. There is a big, long web address there. However, if you just Google Conchies Speak Ontario Mennonites or something like that, it'll probably come up. And within that, there's all kinds of additional things there you can look at. There's articles to read. There's panels from the exhibit that you can see. There was a group of students here who actually looked at individual COs and did research on them and planned out little panels with pictures so you can read more of their individual stories. And we've also digitized the newsletters that they created when they were in camps. And they're just really fascinating to read. All of those newsletters are now up online and available. This is another digital gem that you can use to learn more about Mennonites in your area, perhaps, and Mennonites more generally. This is the guide that I create for Mennonite studies here, subjectguides.uwaterloo.ca/Menno-studies. And under the digital collections tab, you'll find a map of Mennonite churches and Amish districts in Ontario, which will include churches in your area. The Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia online, and many congregations have individual entries. So if you're curious about congregations in your area, those will be in there too. There's the first 2 volumes of a 3-volume set called Mennonites in Canada. So if you really want to get in depth, you can read Mennonite history from 1786 to 1940. And there's also the Mennonite Archival Information Database, and all of the photographs that you have seen in my presentation and about 600 more from Montreal River and from Ontario Mennonites experiences in British Columbia. Those are all on there and searchable. So there's lots of time you could spend looking through all of that. And finally, just in general, this is us, grable.ca/MAO, Mennonite Archives of Ontario. There's a picture of our reading room there. You're welcome to come and visit us once things reopen again. And I look forward to any questions you might have about my presentation or anything else about the Mennonite Archives. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. That was really interesting. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to put the presentation together. There hasn't been any questions come through the virtual format. I think people are a little bit shy about asking questions, but I just wondered, with the fact that many Mennonites were producing food and sort of an agricultural sphere, would they be exempted for that purpose as well? Like people generally in food production that might keep them focused on the thing that they initially were doing even before the war? Would that come into play at all, or?
Oh, absolutely. And for not just Mennonites, but rural young men in general, the agricultural piece of the war effort was so important. So 10,000 Mennonites and others participated as conscientious objectors, but I don't have the figure in front of me, but it would have been many multiples of that that continue to work in agricultural settings for sure.
I wondered when you were talking too, if where the work camps, would most of the Mennonites largely go to the same project, or would they be kind of fanned out across the country at once?
I would say that the program struggled a bit to find its footing. Like I said, the government wasn't even sure what to do with these guys at first, and so they sent them up to this Depression era work camp. And so in Ontario, Ontario was very much concentrated at Montreal River and a couple of other little smaller camps in the north. In Western Canada, which is a whole other story, they were at first sent actually to several national parks to clear trails and things like that. So if you're visiting a national park in Western Canada, you probably benefit still from that experience. But it's the kind of thing that at first they felt kind of like, well, we're just clearing trails. Like, what's the point? But I think that was the government trying to understand what they could do with these alternative service folks. And as the program developed, as I said, there were at least a dozen camps in British Columbia, scattered all over the place. Some were fairly close to Vancouver and Victoria. Many were in much more remote areas, focused on fighting forest fires and planting trees. And so really you could end up anywhere. You could end up with some of your friends. You could end up being the only one from your community in that particular camp. So yeah, it was really kind of a program developed on the fly.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. I really appreciate your expertise, and it was great to be able to broadcast it out to anyone who watched. So thanks again.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, take care.
You too.